My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
How does PwC take your company to the leading edge? They bring the sharpest minds in tech to your team, so you can bring the ideas that will transform your business. They're passionate about your industry, so you can walk into any room with every advantage. And they're with you every step of the way, so you can know you're headed in the right direction. PwC builds for what's next, so you can get there now. Get started at pwc.com/us/leading edge.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by Professor of Law at Chase Law School, Ken Katkin.
Hey, Michael, it's great to be back.
Yeah, I am looking forward to talking even more politics with you, something we don't get to do as often as I would like, especially now that, I'm no longer at NKU. So, but before we get to the things we sort of had planned for this midweek episode, briefly at the very beginning of the weekend episode, you mentioned that Justice Souter had died, and I hadn't heard of that. It turned out it happened just as literally the announcement, just as we were going on air. And so I thought it would be good to at least spend a little bit of time talking about it, our thoughts on Justice Souter, because from my perspective, he's the sort of justice, even though, ideologically I may not have aligned with him. The sort of justice I don't think we see a lot of anymore. Certainly he was a big disappointment to a lot of folks on the right. But what are your thoughts about Justice Souter's career and legacy, and maybe any other kind of broader thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I've got a lot of thoughts about Justice Souter. I think the way he got on the court was it was interesting, and it wasn't a surprise to me, the direction that his jurisprudence went. And I don't think it was a surprise to President George H.W. Bush, who appointed him either, because he was he had been a New Hampshire Republican. He was a justice on the New Hampshire Supreme Court. He had not been a federal judge at all until he joined the U.S. Supreme Court. He was somewhat close with Governor Sununu of New Hampshire, who was somewhat close with President Bush. But I think the real true story of why he got the nod had to do with abortion politics in the 80s and 90s. And I think what had happened was you had after Roe versus Wade, which was in its own day a very popular and not very controversial decision. By 1980, so Roe versus Wade gets decided in 1973. It was one that the Nixon administration did not file a brief in. It's hard to imagine a later Republican administration not wanting to weigh in an abortion case, but it wasn't one that the Nixon administration wanted to take a position on. But by 1980, when Reagan was running, an important part of the Reagan coalition was the anti-abortion movement. That was part of his platform. Getting justices appointed who would overrule Roe became a significant priority for a segment of Republican voters, and nominally so for Republican presidents. But I think that the actual concept that Reagan had, that George H.W. Bush had, and in fact that George W. Bush also had, I think they all had the concept that politically they wanted the pro-choice people. I'm sorry, they wanted the pro-life people voting for them. They wanted that anti-abortion movement as part of their political constituency, but also they never wanted to succeed in getting Roe overruled because they understood that the majority in the country was always pro-choice. And so there was a lot more energy on the anti-choice side. And so if they could get that energetic minority to be active Republican voters and active Republican Party members, that helped them electorally. But if they ever turned into the dog that actually caught the car, that had great risks to them electorally, because that would turn into abortion into a voting issue for some pro-choice Republicans, which there always were some of. And there really weren't very many anti-choice Democrats. So to the extent that choice became a voting issue, it was not going to redound to the benefit of the Republicans. So I think Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and I'll talk about it in a minute, but in a convoluted way, George W. Bush, what they tried to do to maintain that political balance was appoint some very aggressively anti-choice justices. So Reagan appoints Scalia. H.W. Bush appoints Thomas, but also to make sure that they didn't make all of their appointments go in that direction, to actually split their appointments so that they could go back to their anti-choice constituents and say, look, I gave you Scalia, look, I gave you Thomas, but yet Reagan also gave O'Connor and Kennedy. And for H.W. Bush, he got to make 2 appointments, and they were Clarence Thomas and David Souter. And I'm positive that he knew that David Souter was not going to vote to overrule Roe. In fact, I'm positive that that's the reason that he appointed him, was to appoint someone who did not have a record on that issue, so that in the confirmation hearings, there was really no way that anyone could know which way Souter would vote. But I do believe George H.W. Bush not only knew, but it was an absolute precondition of getting the appointment, was that he would counteract the Thomas vote. And then Bush would be able to go to the anti-choice people and say, I gave you Clarence Thomas, but yet he would never have to defend, what later eventually became the Dobbs case after Trump became the first Republican president. You could say unsophisticated enough to understand that game. And Trump actually did, appoint 3 justices that would all vote to overturn Roe, and they did. But I think none of his predecessors wanted to do that. So that's my take on why Souter got the appointment. I've been talking a long time. You were trying to cut in there.
No, I was just thinking that in thinking about his confirmation hearing, it kind of boggles my mind that in thinking about modern confirmation hearings, that one particular point really stands out is when Chuck Grassley, who, yes, was in the Senate back then, he's like 200 years old. He's still, yeah. But when he asked Souter what he thought about judicial activism, the idea that a Republican-appointed judge, or a Republican-appointed nominee would say, courts must accept their own responsibility for making a just society. Like, what?
Yeah.
Excuse me. And then the fact that he was confirmed 90-9, that it just strikes me as so clearly that was such a different era that we were in back then, and how radically things have changed. I guess that's one thought that's really jumped out to me. And another thing is that it's really kind of amazing to me that he just basically decided, I've had it with the Supreme Court. It's just, I'm done. He was only 69. It's like, no, I'm just, that's it. That's just really, those two things seem to me to be so very unusual, at least by, kind of our modern standards here.
This episode is brought to you by Loom by Atlassian. Are you feeling stuck at work? Get your team unstuck with Loom video messaging and move work forward. Use Loom to simultaneously record both your screen and yourself to share a quick update, provide feedback, train a colleague, and everything in between. Plus, add Loom AI to your meetings for instant written notes and recordings. Try Loom today at Loom.com. That's LOOM.com.
Anyone can follow. It takes something special to be an original. Which is why the 2025 Lincoln Navigator SUV arrives with new ways of surrounding you in luxury, including the ultra-wide 48-inch panoramic display and the multi-sensory Lincoln Rejuvenate experience. A true original never stops evolving. So meet the 2025 Navigator, the original that's all new and better than ever. Learn more at Lincoln.com. Lincoln and Navigator are trademarks of Ford or its affiliates.
Well, the vote wasn't as unusual. The vote was much more about the times than about the candidate, because, both Antonin Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who were, identified. Scalia was an identified conservative justice. Ginsburg was an identified liberal justice. It wasn't, neither of them would have exactly been the kind of possible consensus candidate that Souter was, but they both got even more votes than Souter did. like 90 wasn't much compared to what Scalia or Ginsburg got. They both got like 98 and 99. So I think that was just a sign of the times that the senators in those days thought that what they were basically judging was the qualifications, but they were leaving the ideology questions to the president. And although Thomas was probably the one who broke that, so he was Bush's other appointment. And I do think his ideology was so activist and so really disrespectful of the rule of law that was an unusual kind of appointment. And so I guess he got only 52-48, and that was the next one after Souter. But but then Ginsburg did snap right back to getting more than 90 votes after Thomas. But I think that the Thomas hearings kind of laid the framework, and of course there were some failed ones too. So I shouldn't gloss over those. But Reagan had appointed nominated Bork, and Nixon had nominated Hainsworth and Carswell. So that there were some failed nominations. Johnson had nominated Fortas to be the chief. So there were a few, but yeah, there was a lot. Sometimes it was easier to get the unanimous votes. But I do think he was a consensus candidate. I think Democrats were perfectly satisfied with Souter, and most of the Republicans also voted for him. I don't remember who the 9 were who voted against him, but I don't even know if they skewed more towards Democrats or
all
more
Democrats,
towards Republicans.
Yeah.
All Democrats.
All Democrats,
Yeah. So that was so he was a good justice. He did start out like a more conventionally conservative justice, and in the years that he was on the court, as had happened with some Republican appointees before him, including Stevens, who he was on the court with. Both of those guys, if you look at their early jurisprudence, it fits comfortably into conservative jurisprudence. And both of them, as they were on the court longer, they moved to the left. That's probably also true about Blackmun. So I think Blackmun, Stevens, and Souter all had that trajectory. And some people have said that you see that in the Republican appointees who never worked in the executive branch. That's been a theory I've heard, that the ones who've worked in the executive branch tend to stay as like kind of rock-ribbed conservatives, and the ones who never worked in the executive branch are the ones that tend to have that trajectory to the left. And some people are already starting to perceive that in Justice Barrett, who didn't ever work in the executive branch. Although, of course, Roberts did work in the executive branch, and some people would say that about him as well. So it's, yeah. I'm sorry.
Because I know that a lot of Republicans after that, the battle cry was no more Souters, that sort of thing. And it made me think even back further to, I think it was Eisenhower who said about appointing Earl Warren was the biggest damn fool mistake I ever made. Right. And so.
Yeah. Although I don't think G.H.W. Bush ever looked at it as a mistake that he appointed
exactly,
Souter.
Yeah. Like you were saying about that.
I think the no more Souters thing was actually not the idea that it was Souter that betrayed the conservatives, but more the idea that it was H.W. Bush that betrayed the conservatives. That I think they kind of caught on to this idea, and it wasn't just H.W. I mean, so as I said, Reagan gave them both O'Connor and Kennedy, as well as giving them Scalia, who they liked, and then Bush gave them Thomas, who they liked, but then Souter. And I think the conservatives caught on to the idea that Republican presidents wanted to give the far right, some red meat, but not enough to actually, control the court. And I was going to say with G.W. Bush, not everyone remembers this because he got stymied, but that no more Souters slogan was actually successfully invoked against his first Supreme Court nominees. So if you remember, he nominated his own White House counsel, Harriet Miers. Yeah. And the no more Souters rallying cry was very much invoked against her and caused him to withdraw that nomination. But that's the one where I think he was really trying to carry on the tradition, the Souter type tradition of, he was definitely going to make some nominations that the far right was going to be happy with. But I think he didn't want to give them all his nominations because he didn't want to shift the balance of power on the court all the way over there. And so I think his nomination of Miers was every bit as intentional as his father's nomination of Souter. But this time the far right rebelled against it under that slogan, no more Souters, and they were able to block it.
I'm wondering that point you raised about potentially conservative presidents or Republican presidents appointing people without that sort of background in the executive branch. And you mentioned Justice Barrett, who a lot of conservatives are very unhappy with. And it makes me wonder if under a Trump 2.0, assuming there's going to be, if there is, in fact, another opening in the next 3+ years, if the rallying cry is going to be no more Barretts, or making sure essentially that anyone who's nominated is so absolutely clear, has a track record of just being super or semi-super MAG. I don't know. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that'll happen. I mean, fortunately, from my perspective, if there's an opening in the next few years, it's going to be either from Thomas's seat or from Alito's seat. So I don't think there's a lot of room for the court to get worse. No matter even if he puts Justice Eileen Cannon on the court, I don't think that's actually all that much worse than Thomas or Alito. I think there's almost no room to get worse than those two. But I do think that will be a rallying cry for sure. I mean, with Trump more than anything else, that's been his rallying cry through his entire executive branch. Is like the only thing that matters is someone who's got unlimited personal loyalty to him, and that any kind of just anybody with any kind of ideological commitments that that doesn't, the only thing they're allowed to have is complete loyalty to him and being willing to shift on a dime to support him. And I think he will look for the same kind of person that he's been appointing to his administration. I think he just announced today that he's going to put the Fox News commentator, Jeanine Pirro, in for the U.S. attorney and temporary U.S. attorney in D.C. And I think that's the kind of person he would seek to put on the Supreme Court. And, right now he's got 54 Republican senators, and that's probably 53 Republican senators. And that's probably enough to jam someone like that through. You never know. But I do think that's what he would look for, and it might be under the slogan "No More Barretts." I don't necessarily think, though, that he would follow the conventional wisdom that what he wants is someone who's worked in the executive branch. I think what he wants is probably someone that's been on Fox News.
We hope you enjoyed this preview of our supporters exclusive midweek show. If you'd like to hear the rest of the episode, we hope you'll consider becoming a supporter. Supporters get ad-free access to all of our shows, membership in our Politics Guys Discord group where you can join in on the conversation, and other benefits at different levels of support. To become a supporter, go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through Venmo or @politicsguys, or through PayPal. You'll find all of our support links in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And if you'd like to get the midweek show, but you're not in a position to become a financial supporter, that's not a problem. Just send me an email at mike@politicsguys.com, and I'll be happy to get that set up for you.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,